Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I was sitting with the CEO of one of America's biggest and most influential companies last month, and I asked him a simple question. What could President Trump do that would be a bridge too far for you? What attack on democracy or the rule of law could Trump make that would cause you to speak up? His answer was pretty simple, and it was pretty confident. He said that if Trump were to ignore a Supreme Court ruling, that would cross the line. He was reflecting a familiar theme, that until President Trump thumbs his nose definitively at a court ruling, then his attacks on democracy are troubling but not lethal. It's normal politics up until that dramatic confrontation between the executive branch and the judicial branch, for which the Constitution, as we know, really has no prescribed remedy. And for many Americans, they may breathe a sigh of relief that America's most influential private sector leaders would rise up to defend democracy if this confrontation that we worry about came to pass. Combined with a massive public mobilization, we could be saved. But I didn't breathe a sigh of relief. The opposite. I'm deeply worried that we have really spent little time studying the paths that democracies take when they collapse. Most of the time, there is not a singular moment when the executive dramatically seizes power. There's not normally a brazen attempt to burn down the Parliament building. No, instead, democracies die when gradually, often quietly and methodically over time, the structures that hold the executive accountable for corruption, for thievery, for wrongdoing are dismantled. Dismantled so that citizens can no longer hold the executive accountable. Dismantled so that the political opposition never has enough room to maneuver meaningfully. There are still elections. The executive doesn't try to stuff the ballot box. Occasionally at lower levels, the opposition still wins. But what happens is that those structures of accountability are either so degraded or so completely co-opted by the regime that the truth is just buried, and the political opposition loses the basic tools that it needs to win. In every democracy that stops being a democracy, then there's a familiar story. There are 4 institutions that the regime attacks, and attacks relentlessly until those structures of accountability are so disintegrated that even though elections continue to happen, the same party or the same person wins power election after election. And those 4 institutions are the press, the legal profession, universities, and the business community. If you degrade or co-opt these 4 institutions, you never need to have a high-stakes fight with the top court in your country. You don't need to burn the Reichstag down. You can still have elections, but only one party will win. So that's why this CEO's assurance, frankly, sent a chill down my spine. Because our democracy isn't at risk of dying, it is dying. As we speak, we are watching it die. It is not too late to save it. Let me say that again. It is not too late to save our democracy, but we can't continue to close our eyes and think that our democracy can survive a coordinated assault on those 4 key institutions of accountability. Democrats and Republicans need to see what is happening before our eyes. Rise up and defend the independence of journalists, of lawyers, of universities, and of the private sector. So I want to spend a minute or two to walk you through what President Trump is doing and how it frankly, chillingly mirrors the tactics that other leaders have used to transition real democracy into pretend fake democracy. It always starts with journalists. From Hungary to Belarus to Venezuela, countries that have elections, but elections where one party just keeps on winning, these are places where journalists are subject to nonstop harassment campaign from the regime, such that people just stop doing journalism or journalists stop telling the full truth. Last month, for instance, the Turkish president, Erdogan, locked up 11 journalists simply because they were covering protests against Erdogan's jailing of the top opposition leaders. Now, Trump has not started jailing journalists, but the pace of harassment in the first 60 days of his second term is alarming. He's denied access to government buildings, including the White House, to journalists who don't use pre-approved language from the White House. He is preferencing credentials to partisan journalists who simply parrot his party line. His FCC has begun to deliberately harass media companies that are owned by political opponents of the president. But Trump's campaign to destroy independent journalism, it has a darker and more menacing side, because Trump isn't just trying to intimidate journalists so that they'll be afraid to tell the truth. He's also trying to destroy the concept of truth itself. And again, this is a key facet of leaders who are elected who are trying to transition democracies away and into something very different. How do you destroy truth? Well, that's why the Secretary of Defense looks into the camera and tells the American public that the text messages that everybody read, filled with classified information and war plans, did not include classified information and war plans. The White House wants you to believe that 1 + 1 does not equal 2 any longer, that you should doubt even the clear things that you see with our eyes, that nothing is real, that nothing is true, that if you are a supporter of the regime and I tell you 1 + 1 = 3, then 1 + 1 = 3. Those weren't war plans. Those weren't classified documents. That's also why the official position of the White House on key issues like tariffs changes every hour. Because if the ground truth just changes constantly, then there's no truth at all. Journalists are made to look foolish by reporting a true thing at 9 a.m. that becomes untrue at 10 a.m. Journalism loses its credibility when the facts being distributed by the White House change all the time. Trump says the tariffs are permanent. Journalists report the president says the tariffs are permanent. An hour later, Trump says, I never said they're permanent. They're not permanent. I'm cutting deals. They write that he's cutting deals. An hour later, they're suspended. No more tariffs. When the truth changes constantly, it's hard to believe that there's anything true any longer. Second, universities are always a target of would-be autocrats. Again, in Turkey, the government has terminated thousands of professors just because they criticize the government. In Hungary, one of the nation's most prestigious universities was forced to move out of the country because President Orban attacked it so ceaselessly for fomenting protest against his government. Universities over the long history of democracy have been the place where protest, especially youth protest, begins. They are a thorn in the side of leadership. The famous Tiananmen Square protests in China were, of course, started by university students. So it's no surprise that if you want to crush democracy, you need to crush the independence of universities. That's why Trump's decision to target universities that permit criticism of President Trump is so bone-chilling. He pretends like he's standing up to anti-Semitism on campuses, but what he's really trying to do is make clear that protests against his policies on campuses will result in federal funding being cut off. Columbia University was forced to agree to a stunning list of free speech concessions in order to gain assurances from President Trump that their federal funding would continue. They had to agree to allow campus police to arrest protesters. They had to essentially agree to receivership, federal receivership, over an academic department that houses professors who are critical of Trump and his policies. Effectively, the President of the United States got to pick the person who will oversee the Columbia Department on the Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies, as well as the Center for Palestine Studies. That is extraordinary. That's not what happens in a healthy democracy. The leader of the country micromanaging academic departments at major universities to assure that academic work aligns with the regime. And now, having successfully forced Columbia to bend the knee and quell dissent on their campus, Trump is targeting other universities. Some of them will sign similar agreements, giving President Trump power over those campuses. But frankly, all Trump has to do is make an example of a handful of universities, and others will simply comply and obey in advance. Why, as an academic president, when you've got federal dollars that employ people at your university, would you permit a major protest against a Trump policy if you know that that's going to jeopardize federal funds? Or maybe you allow it because you don't want to so brazenly stand in the way of free speech, but you just make sure that it's not too big a protest or it's not too critical. You police speech to be on the right side of the regime. That is what happens in all of these fake democracies, and that is what's happening here. But controlling speech on campuses is not enough. Controlling and intimidating journalists is not enough. You got to go after the lawyers, too. Now, maybe there's not a lot of love for lawyers in this country, but lawyers are the ones that bring the lawsuits to stop the thievery and the illegality. Lawyers are compelled by their oath to stand up for the Constitution. Putin arrested Navalny's lawyers right on the eve of Navalny's trial. In Venezuela, Maduro routinely harasses and detains lawyers, human rights lawyers, because he knows those are the ones that will hold him accountable. In Tunisia, the regime stormed the offices of the Bar administration to intimidate the legal profession into silence. Here in America, Trump is engaged in a shameless campaign of extortion against any major law firm that has taken a position against Trump or Trump's interests. What he is doing is extraordinary, and it is mind-blowing to me that it is just being ignored by my Republican colleagues. He's going firm by firm, and not to every firm, just to the firms that have represented Democrats or brought cases against him. And he's telling them that if they don't fall in line and stop doing work to oppose him, their clients will lose access to federal work. That is extortion. This body, Republicans and Democrats, should stand up against it. But it is working. Several law firms have signed deals with Trump that obligate them to support, guess what, causes aligned with Donald Trump. Paul Weiss was targeted by an executive order and struck a deal. But so did Skadden. They struck a deal with Trump before they'd even been targeted. Already, collectively, these firms have pledged, think about this, about $250 million of pro bono work to file cases in coordination with the President of the United States' political interests. And just like what happened with the universities, there's a lot of extra compliance that's happening. I know for a fact that firms that have already signed these agreements with Trump have gone above and beyond the terms of the agreements to quiet their criticism of the government. And no doubt every single major law firm will think twice before bringing an action against an illegal or corrupt action of the president in fear of Trump retaliating against their business. That's the point.